All through the day, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine. All through the night, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine. Now they're frightened of leaving it. Everyone's weaving it, going on strong all the time. All through the day, I, me, mine. Those are lyrics written by George Harrison of the Beatles, for those of you who remember the Beatles. Right? And as I was writing the script for this video, this song kept popping into my mind. So I felt that this may have to do with the topic of, or the teaching of no self, or rather the Buddha's challenge to all of us to find a self within this experience. Now, to verify that, I checked with my dear friend Pete, hey Pete, who is really knowledgeable concerning the Beatles, and he said that the song is really about two things. The first thing is about the legal issues the Beatles were embroiled in later in their careers concerning Apple Records and all that stuff. The second one, he said, is about ego. So in this 20-minute video, because this one's going to be longer than the typical videos, which are around 10 minutes, we're going to discuss this very, well, it's complex and it's nuanced, the Buddha's teaching on this particular topic, all right? So welcome to Seeking the Buddha, where we will explore this enigmatic and fascinating topic. We have a guest with us today. Her name is Theodora, and she's our cat, and she's totally awesome. And she may or may not stick around. She may appear later on if she's like that. Anyway, before we get, oh, there she goes. So before we get to this next section, I would like to ask you to please subscribe if you like what you're seeing, and please like the video or share it or comment on it, right? That's all I'll say. You know what to do. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's take a look at our tainted perceptions, right? In previous videos, we've looked at the example of, given the example of a mirage, because our senses are not entirely accurate. I mean, look at the electromagnetic spectrum. How much can we see or detect of the electromagnetic spectrum? It's like that much, right? I'd like to use another example that further bewilders me concerning this process that we go through, all right? And that is color. You know, is how we see color, how we interpret color, right? So I did some research and I found 3 scientific principles concerning color. Number 1, color as a perception. Color, as we experience it, is a perception created by the brain, not an inherent property of objects. Holy smokes. Okay, number 2, wavelengths of light. Objects don't have color. They reflect certain wavelengths of light, and our eyes and brains interpret those wavelengths as colors. Wow. And the final one, subjective experience. Now, subjective is an interesting word to use here. Different people can perceive colors differently. And even the same person can perceive colors differently under different conditions. Now we discover that not only do we see mirages, but that color doesn't even exist. It's wavelengths of light bouncing off certain things, and our brain interprets it as color. Wow. So my point being here is, if we can't detect what's going on outside of us, how can we possibly be accurate in detecting what's going on inside? At this point, we should all be familiar with the concept of impermanence, or certainly the Buddha's teachings on impermanence, right? And if you haven't seen the previous videos, please go back and watch them. They're only 10 minutes long, and this is the longer one. So impermanence, as we know, was a core teaching of the Buddha. You know, all is impermanence. Nothing here is permanent. And we know that. It's common sense. However, I want to put this in a proper perspective, and it is a historical perspective in this case. When the Buddha was talking about impermanence, this was revolutionary, okay? Because the dominant faith of the time was Hinduism. Now, Hinduism teaches us that there is a permanent self or soul, you know, if you will, that called Anātman, and there is a greater consciousness, right, called Brahman. And the idea is for the lesser, you know, the individual, not lesser, but the individual, you know, self to join with the greater consciousness, Brahman, okay? So, of course, the Buddha saw the concept of Atman and Brahman as, absolutism. It was an extreme, right? So these two really butted heads here. So the teaching of impermanence today may not seem so revolutionary, but back then it was cataclysmic, all right? But we have to understand, this is very important, the Buddha never said there is no self. He never made that claim. He was silent on that. What he did do is he challenged us to find a self within us, right? To find evidence of a self. So how did the Buddha define what the human experience is? He came up with something called the 5 aggregates. Let's take a look at that. Before we look at the 5 aggregates, I'm going to tell you an interesting story. It's from a Buddhist text concerning an encounter between a king Menanda I, who was a 2nd century king, and a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. Nagasena appears before the king. The king asks him his name and why he's here. Okay, obviously. Nagasena says, "O king, I am known as Nagasena, but that is only a designation in common use, a conventional term given to me by my parents, for no permanent individual can be found." Well, as you might imagine, the king was somewhat startled by this answer, right? Obviously, he didn't study Buddhism, right? He wasn't a monk himself, right? So he was completely baffled by this, but this kind of turns into an irritation. The king gets a little irritated by this statement because he's given a lot to the Buddhist monks, to their order, right? So the king says, "If, most reverend Nagasena, there is no permanent individual, who donates robes, food, and lodging to your monastic order?" Obviously, the king had done this, and he's questioning this. "Who is it that enjoys such gifts, lives a righteous life, meditates, and aims for nirvana?" Obviously, he's commenting on Nagasena. "If men were to kill you, would there be no murder? If no self exists, then what meaning is there in teachings and ordinations?" So the king's question highlighted what he believed to be a contradiction in Buddhist teachings here, right? He further said to Nagasena, "What does the name Nagasena mean if Nagasena can't be found? Is Nagasena in his body, actions, ideas, or consciousness?" Now, Nagasena's answer provided an incredible insight into this teaching, okay? Here's what he said. "Where is the essence of a chariot, Your Highness? Is it in the wheels, the framework, the axle, the yoke, or the spokes of the wheels?" Interesting question. The king answered, "None of these things alone is the chariot or its essence." Nagasena countered, "But if we assemble these parts, would you call it a chariot?" The king responded, "Yes, because the arrangement of the parts in a specific way is perceived as a chariot." Perceived is an interesting word, isn't it? So Nagasena finally replies, "In the same way, a self is merely a conventional term. Like the chariot, a self is a configuration of parts, body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. There is no independent, permanent, or unchanging self. There is no essence apart from these elements." King Menanda got up from his throne, walked down to the monk, and stood before him and bowed to the monk because he understood what the monk was saying. He understood the teaching of what the self is comprised of. Kind of blew him away. Great story, isn't it? I'm going to read you something from my book because I use this story in my book, which is upcoming book, I should say. Okay. The concept called no self reveals that no permanent self exists because the self is composed of phenomena that rely on other conditions to exist. Remember, causes and conditions. It conveys that all things arise independently, interconnectedly, and conditioned by prior causes. And we talked about this with dependent origination, right? We are devoid of an independent existence. We're empty of or devoid of, but we are full of dependency and interdependency. So let's talk about the 5 aggregates. Now, the word aggregates also means like heaps, like Nagasena was talking about. A bunch of stuff that assembled in the proper configuration, as the king said, is perceived as a chariot, okay? All right? And the same thing with the self. these 5 aggregates, which are form, feeling, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, all right, are part of the 5. They're each one of the aggregates. Okay, now form is, of course, the physical nature of what we experience. Okay, the other 4 are part of the mind, right? So let's take a look at form first. Now, the Buddha compared form to a lump of foam because it's here and then it's gone, right? It's impermanent, obviously, right? The next one is feelings. Now, by feelings, and Nagasena called them sensations, and that's exactly, it's more precise in feelings because the Buddha was talking about pleasant sensations, neutral sensations, and unpleasant sensations as you go through our experience. Okay. Then perceptions. Now, perception, of course, we've studied a lot, all right? We talked about the illusion, mirages and color. Obviously, perceptions are not very accurate either. Mental formations are how our brain puts them together. Kind of, we put it together and then we form an image or an archetype of that particular thing. The water on the horizon, even though it's a mirage, it looks like water. So the brain says that's water. Mental formations, the Buddha compared that to the internal composition of a banana tree or a plantain tree. Apparently, when you cut one of these things open, all right, all you have is layers of this fibrous material, but there is no central core, which is a great analogy if you're thinking about the self. If there is no self, we have all these, these illusory things surrounding it. It gives us the delusion that we have a self. So then we have consciousness, which of course the Buddha believed to be somewhat illusory because our senses are incapable of interpreting the world properly. The Buddha knew this, which is kind of incredible if you think about it. All 5 of these aggregates are impermanent, right? They're all impermanent. Nothing is permanent here. And they're also empty. So the final way I want to tie this up in a bow, the 5 aggregates, and that is it's causality. Okay. So in other words, consciousness arises due to mental formations. Mental formations arises due to perceptions. Perceptions arise due to feelings. Feelings or sensations arise due to form. So it's this, again, arising and ceasing, arising and ceasing. That's how everything is linked. Okay, that's how the 5 aggregates are linked, right? So the Buddha defines the human experience using the 5 aggregates. Okay, now I have a kind of my own take on this, and I'd like to talk about this in the final section of this video. I call it the stream. So we've come to the final part of this video, and I thank those of you who have stayed with me through all these parts, and I hope this is making some kind of sense. I know it's complex and it's nuanced, but I hope I'm able to shed some light on this, the concept of no self, which is critical to understanding Buddha's teachings, all right? So there is a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus who came up with this kind of brilliant concept. And he said, you can never step into the same stream twice. That's true. I want you to picture in your mind a scenario. You're in the forest. It's a beautiful summer day. It's a little hot, a little warm. So you're walking through the forest and there's a stream. And you get there, you go, I'm going to take off my shoes and walk through the stream. So you take off your shoes. You put your first foot in the stream. The stream is moving. It's flowing, right? You put your other foot in the stream, and that foot experiences a totally different stream. It's completely changed from your first step in the water. That second step, it's totally different, right? Because the stream is always changing. It's always moving. Everything's changing in the stream. Well, guess what? Not only is the stream changing, but you're changing. You're changing from moment to moment. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago, I'll guarantee you. There may be aspects of yourself that are similar, that have stayed with you, but you're different. So we have to think of ourselves as a stream. We have to think of ourselves as a verb and not a noun. Okay, right? And we are a stream, and the 5 aggregates are flowing through us, right? Form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These are flowing through us. They disconnect and they connect. They join together and they separate. And this is the human experience. This is how I think of it. The only constant in this realm in which we live is change. Change is the only constant. How can there be, if you think about it, how can anything be permanent in a place where everything is constantly changing? It's pretty amazing, isn't it? What do you think, Theo? Pretty cool, huh? Our powers of perception, as we've learned, are not accurate enough for us to correctly define what's going on around us. So, of course, how can they be accurate enough to define what's going on within us? Right? Well, let's look at that George Harrison lyric again. All through the day, I me mine, I me mine, I me mine. All through the night, I me mine, I me mine, I me mine. And the three most important verses here, let me explain. Frightened of leaving it, we fear letting go of impermanent things. Remember, we cling to things that are impermanent, and that causes us ultimately suffering or disillusionment. Everyone's weaving it. We all live and believe in the delusion of a permanent self. And going on strong all the time, the constant flow of change, which we are unable and unwilling to accept, that we are living in this world of impermanence. And it's a tough thing to accept. It's tough to step out of that and realize that maybe there is no self. Maybe the Buddha's right. So, of course, you may be asking yourself, Tony, do you believe that there is no self? Have you found evidence that there is no self? The answer to that question is complicated, of course, because in some ways, I believe the Buddha is absolutely right, okay? And in some ways, I'm not so sure he's right. I feel like, no, there's a self. You know, I'm here. I'm talking to you, right? Okay? What I can tell you is I use the philosophical component when someone's upset with me, right? I used to work at an Apple store. So, you know, if you've ever worked with the general public, you know what I'm talking about, okay? 99% of the people are really nice. You know, it's just an experience. It's fine. That 1%, they're having a bad day or something, it can be ugly. And people have been yelling at me and all kinds of things. You know, that's just part of the job. Well, if you think of the self as a kind of an ego death, right? So if someone's yelling at me, they're upset with me, what I try to do is I step outside of myself, right? I put my ego aside and I try to look at that person with compassion to see what it is they're upset about. You know, was it something I did? Is it something that happened to them or something they did, right? And then try to resolve that problem. Well, that's what I used to do. Well, I still use that today, all right? We all certainly have egos, right? We all, you know, cling to this concept of a self, right? And that's what causes suffering, because that person's yelling at us. The first thing we do is react. Our ego responds. What are you talking? I didn't do this. This isn't my fault. This is what's going through your mind, right? But if you step outside of that and apply the concept of no self in that particular circumstance, it really helps, right? Because that's what I do. So that's why I'm conflicted sometimes, you know, in concerning the self and no self and that kind of thing. But the Buddha did challenge us, and he challenged us to question his teachings. Accept no dogma, right? Accept no dogma. That's so important. If you hang on to that, you cling to that, that's a great thing to hang on to, right? Because that causes suffering, right? Narratives, dogma, the narratives we've been fed from the cradle to the grave, all they do is cause suffering. Not all they do. There's some good aspects to them, but anyway. So I hope this has made sense. All right. I hope this made sense. And I hope that I've shed some light on this very nuanced, very complex topic. All right. And I hope you've gleaned something from it. So thanks for staying with me for the full 20 or so minutes of this video. I truly appreciate it. Please remember to subscribe and to like, right? And have a wonderful day.